his investors, a lot of his investors were like, "Oh my gosh, this guy's lost his mind. Here's a hedge fund guy that's literally saying, I'm going to shut down my multi-billion-dollar hedge fund and move to Las Vegas and live on the floor of the factory and just will this thing. I'm not going to let it die. I'm not sure how I'm going to put it back together, but it's too valuable of an asset to walk away from." That is really the truth what happened. And people literally thought oh my gosh, Jim's done this. And I knew who Jim is, and I was like, I think he's got something. I didn't see it. It truly is this is the American dream.
Welcome to Learning from Leaders, a podcast from Southwestern Medical Foundation where we dive into a world of wisdom, mentorship, and innovation, exploring the insights and life lessons of seasoned community and business leaders. I'm Michael McMahon, President and CEO of Southwestern Medical Foundation. I invite you to subscribe now and join us on this empowering journey of growth and leadership. Now, let's learn from the best and drive meaningful change together.
Well, I'm Lili Clark. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. So happy to have everyone in this room here. And Jim and Drew, thank you both so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Okay, so let's dive right in.
Okay.
I'd love to start by talking about Dallas. You both have made the move to Dallas pretty recently. Could you talk about what brought you here, perhaps what your expectations were coming in, and how those expectations may or may not have turned into reality?
Sure. I guess I'll kick it off.
Sure.
Well, and thank you all for having me here. That was a really incredible video, and I'm obviously happy to be here for such a great cause. So the reason I ended up here, it was a very official process, actually. As you know, and I'm sure we'll talk plenty about it, I'm founder, chairman, and CEO of MP Materials, and we are restoring the full rare earth supply chain to the United States, and I'm sure we'll talk plenty about that. But we were looking to see where we would build our magnet factory, and we were running a sweepstakes, deciding where we would go. Red states, blue states, purple states, looking at communities where it would be good to bring employees, where we could do business. And there were a number of contenders in Texas, actually, and I got introduced, somewhere along the way, I got introduced to Ross Perot, and I saw Alliance, and I was just blown away by what he's done out there. And then I also, had a incredible conversation with him where he basically said, Jim, what you guys are doing is so important to the country, so important to us. Whatever you need, we're going to make sure from Alliance in the state of Texas that this will get done right. And so that, coupled with all of the great aspects of Dallas, which we can talk about, that was really the clincher. But of course, we love Dallas and the community and all of that, but that was sort of the thing that ultimately sealed the deal for us.
How about you, Drew?
Sure. I had some family ties. Fortress had actually had an office here since 2002, so I'd visited here probably about once a year, coming to our office since 2002, or maybe since 2005. But my wife's a Houstonian and went to SMU, so we had some family ties. And then we were back here for one of her reunions, which I won't say which, and we were close to pulling the trigger in 2019. And then when COVID happened, that sort of was what pushed us over the edge. My sister-in-law already lived here with her young family, and then actually my in-laws, who were 70-year Houstonians, moved here about 2 weeks before we did in 2020. So it's been kind of a family affair. I think for us, from a business perspective, we'd always had a big office, but I think opening this up and now expanding it has been really fun to see, and I think there's been an enthusiasm and a welcoming from the business community, which has been palpable.
Absolutely. And the city, as I think we all have kind of been able to witness every single day, is growing so fast in terms of population. We're attracting more talent here than any other city in the country right now. We're attracting investment capital. Could you talk about what you think makes Dallas really unique from a business perspective? I wonder, Jim, if you could kind of walk us through in a little bit more detail your site selection process. Like, what stood out specifically about Dallas compared to some of these other cities you were looking at?
Yes, and I guess Alliance is technically in Fort Worth, so I hope that's not offensive to the people in the room. But that was part of, but that I think it's actually a really interesting thing, because what's so special about this area is you really, no matter what kind of business you're bringing, Dallas historically, I think in Texas is known as a bit more of a financial center, and then there are other areas where maybe heavy industry goes. Of course, Fort Worth being one of them. But we made the decision. I think a lot of people, there's no right way to run one of these processes, but we looked at all of the things around, political clout, what kind of tax credits we could get, all of those things, and at the end of the day, because this was sort of a first of its kind factory, I kind of threw those aside and just said, where would be the right place to attract talent, to really build a business, to be able to attract a variety of talent, and frankly, sort of this probably using the wrong word, you can tell I'm an outsider, but this marriage of Dallas and Fort Worth, if you will, but this combined area where we knew we could get sort of very talented blue collar type work all the way up through engineers and historically white collar work was a big thing for us. And so it really, I could take you through all the aspects of our process, but really at the end of the day, it was, sort of where is a great growing city that we knew was going to be a good place to do business, that we could attract a variety of talent. And I guess I should also, of course, I should have led with this. My wife likes it here a lot. And then, of course, Drew had already moved here, so that helped too.
Yeah, and I am still on Jim's board, and I was on the board at the time when they were doing this site selection. And I can remember the first board meeting. Jim is very open-minded. I think it's one of his best qualities as an investor. But he was wide open with where the factory was going to be built. There was a sense that I remember the word academic hub because a lot of the folks that Jim's hired are PhDs, and you're talking about, literally building a magnet facility that doesn't exist in North America and hasn't been done very much in the Western Hemisphere. And so, truly next level. And there was some sense that academic hub, and so Cambridge and Chicago and Silicon Valley were definitely, I would say, the favorites on a blind basis before they got any proposals. And we talked about Dallas and even Austin. And I remember the next board meeting, and some of the board members were somewhat dismissive because of this academic hub. We have to attract PhDs. And I remember the next board meeting where Jim came in and said, okay, 2 of the 5 finalists are actually in the DFW area. It was not just Alliance, but there was a site in Allen as well. There were 2 of the 5 finalists after this, nationwide search. And so that's obviously a testament to what's going on here. I think one of the things that I always, you don't hear it as much, but when we first moved here in 2020, a lot of people talked about a Texas miracle. And I take issue with that because I don't think it's a miracle, because miracles are when something happens that isn't deliberate. And I think what's happening here and what you think about what Alliance is, right? Ross Perot had a vision 25 years ago, maybe 30 years ago. And a lot of people thought he was crazy when he talked about what Alliance was going to be. It's like, wait, it's right next to DFW and we've already got Love Field. We don't need another airport. And he had a very, specific vision around what Alliance could be and now what it has become. And like Jim said, at the end of the day, what Alliance could offer MP, there wasn't really another close second. And that, I think, is a testament to kind of the deliberate policy that has given Texas the growth it's had, given Dallas the growth it's had, but also I think for us, as we have moved, have hired 150 people here in Texas, a lot of confidence, and frankly, just as much confidence on the next 20, 30 years of growth, because I think Dallas continues to invest in the infrastructure that I think within Texas that has a lot of positive things going on. I think the infrastructure specifically in the DFW Metroplex area is, truly, unparalleled in the country that I'm aware of.
That's great. And I'd love to learn a little bit more about each of your business experiences. So Jim, maybe starting with you. Of course, MP Materials has been the major player in really building the U.S.'s rare earth supply chain. Could you talk about just kind of how you got into this space and what really caught your eye about it? Sure.
I'll do a quick version. So I guess my first job out of grad school on Wall Street was actually at Fortress. And I sat next to Drew in 2005. And I left soon thereafter to start my own fund. And I do remember I consider this my claim to fame to this day, and I always tell Drew this, is that the day I walked out, I said, Drew, I think you'll be CEO of this place one day. So I turned out to be right on that. But so I started a fund, and I was running a fund in Chicago for about 15 years and had a great time doing it, and kind of navigated well through the financial crisis and a lot of environments, and then came across what was a public company at the time called Molycorp that owned this rare earth mine, and I had remembered it going public, and there was a lot of buzz about, this is a really important site for national security. This is important for electric vehicles and supply chain. All this stuff is now in China and blah blah blah, and I thought nothing of it. And then actually our big theme in 2014, we were very thematic investors, but and maybe this will hit home in this building, but our big theme in 14 was shorting energy, because OPEC was in the process of breaking, and so that was a great year for us on that front. And in early 15, we were looking for babies with the bathwater. What are commodities-oriented names that had gotten sort of unfairly hit by sort of the whole collapse, and then I came across this Molycorp, which was clearly headed to bankruptcy, and so I'll fast forward. There was a long battle that led to it, but I essentially bought a bunch of the bonds as it was headed into bankruptcy. I never expected to end up owning this, but it went in. It filed. It went into total free fall. They were going to reclaim the site. It was just going to be gone forever. I think there was a perception at the time. Not a single financial or strategic buyer showed up to buy it, and there was a perception at the time that it just was uneconomic and couldn't work. And so kicked in a little bit of money just to keep it in care and maintenance and fight through the bankruptcy battle. And my view was, so long as I don't throw any good money after bad, I will give blood, sweat, and tears to try to figure this out, because the scale, I couldn't believe, I often joke, I made the mistake of going out and seeing these assets, because it just, the scale of what was there was pretty incredible. And I couldn't believe also, just from a national security standpoint, that we were going to just let this thing go to reclamation, lose your permit in the state of California, and I think you're gone for good. And so we could probably do a whole podcast on the bankruptcy battle, but ended up buying it out of bankruptcy, turning it around, and in 2020, with Drew's help, took it public. As part of that process in going public, what had been sort of a small side pocket for my fund became, it was like a $36 million side pocket that became ultimately a multi-billion-dollar gain for the fund. So it was great for my investors, but it was obviously a really important business and asset. And I made the decision as part of going public to return the liquid capital from JHL and just fully focus on building this business. So that was almost 5 years ago. And so that's how I ended up totally accidentally in this business and in this seat.
That's pretty incredible. So I can't not ask, with the current political landscape, tell us how you're thinking. I know you're so focused on building the supply chain in the U.S. Tell us what you're thinking over the last few days. How should we be thinking about the next few months?
Sure. So many thoughts on that. I'll try, and I'm curious what you think too, Drew. Yes. Well, I said this the other day. I think there's, especially in the media, there's so much hype around this academic view that the president's starting a trade war, and trade wars are bad, and it's gonna, there's sort of this ivory tower Wall Street view. And by the way, a lot of Wall Streeters who helped elect the president, but there's this view that a trade war is bad. And I'm of the view that there's been a trade war going on against us for the last 30 years. And this is some of you may have heard me say this, but I just think this is a fascinating stat. The sort of the standard, sort of liberal talking point, the professor who's never sort of worked a hard day will always come out and say, trade wars are bad. Everybody loses. Smoot-Hawley, that's, look at the Great Depression. And in 1930, the United States ran a 2.5% trade surplus, and 40% of our economy was manufacturing. Fast forward to today, we have a 3% trade deficit, and 10% of our economy is manufacturing. And so you start to realize, well, actually, a trade war is really bad for the trade surplus country, not the trade deficit country. Obviously, it can go very badly for everybody. But I think there's a lot of sort of, fake news, misinformation, et cetera, out there, because I see it every day. And I will tell you, I'm a Yale undergrad. I trained, in economics, and I studied under the super fancy economists who won Nobel Prizes and would tell you all about how trade wars are bad. And, I ran a hedge fund. But in seeing in real life, trying to build one of these businesses and seeing the non-tariff barriers that exist for manufacturing businesses and real businesses, and I'm sure many of the people in the room see these too, it is mind-blowing. I mean, it is real. And so I think I have a unique vantage point from seeing sort of both sides of sort of that pure financial side to then actually trying to build one of these things and seeing, and we can talk through those, the types of roadblocks that the Chinese have on us in specifically the national security industries. And so that's a long-winded way of saying, style aside, if it's not your flavor, I think what this administration is doing is totally appropriate. It's sort of ripping a Band-Aid that needs to be ripped. I don't know, this could be very treacherous. It already is treacherous. It could be very treacherous for us. It could certainly devolve and be, negative for the world in the short term. But I really do think that in the medium to long term, this current environment is something that had to happen for us as a country, and it's a good thing.
What do you think, Drew?
Well, most of what I know about the trade war is what Jim tells me when I call him and ask him what's going on, because he really is, truly what MP is dealing with right now in terms of producing something that right now only China actually gets out of the ground in the Western Hemisphere. And it truly is right in the middle. I do think there's a real risk that we go into some sort of earnings recession within the U.S. But I think, like Jim said, I'm not sure if that's not something that we actually need to go through to then kind of reinvent the global supply chain. The one thing, just because Jim and I have known each other for 20 years now, I was there at Fortress when Jim left, and what was your seed investor was $10 million? So Jim left Fortress with a seed investor of $10 million, and which is very risky. And his only guarantee was that, and this is, I think, Jim's vision and his confidence in himself, but his vision was the $10 million investor gave him office space and told him he had the space for 3 years. And that was all he needed to go do it himself. 2007, right? So at the time, things were still going up, but then very quickly, the whole world changes. And if you're a startup hedge fund in 2008, it's the number of startup hedge funds that were in existence in 2008 that were in existence in 2009 or 2010, you can probably count on like one hand. And Jim built it into a multi-billion-dollar hedge fund, successful through all that. You heard about the way he thinks about the world and like his vision. I remember talking to him about Molly Court back in 2014 and 2015, and he had this vision, and he bought these bonds, and he was working through it, and we were talking about different ideas. And then he goes through bankruptcy, and we talked about teaming up on it back then. He went and did this, right, and goes and buys this asset out of bankruptcy. His investors, a lot of his investors were like, "Oh my gosh, this guy's lost his mind. Here's a hedge fund guy that's literally saying, I'm going to shut down my multi-billion-dollar hedge fund and move to Las Vegas and live on the floor of the factory and just will this thing. I'm not going to let it die. I'm not sure how I'm going to put it back together, but it's too valuable of an asset to walk away from." And that was, hopefully I'm not insulting you, but
no, thank you.
Like that is really the truth. What happened? Like, and people literally thought like, "Oh my gosh, Jim's done this." And I knew who Jim is, and I was like, I think he's got something. Like I didn't see it, but I knew that he was onto something. And then we stayed in touch, and we were lucky enough to partner with him on bringing it public. But and then all the LPs that stuck with him made 100 times their money and were really valuable. There were some investors that didn't stick with him, and they're lost. But it truly is like, this is like the American dream that I think is amazing. And I do think he was talking about what is now we're facing in this sort of supply chain, bringing back, onshoring in the U.S. That this is I think probably the right in the crosshairs, but there's a whole host of them. So for us, I think we're trying to navigate it just from realizing the businesses that are going to be affected and try to make sure we, keep our powder dry. And I think from an opportunity in the U.S., I think it's a great opportunity over a long period, over the next 2 to 5 years. The part that worries me the most is just the political winds that will blow going into midterms and beyond, and whether, as a country, we have the ability to kind of hold it together to see through this kind of transition.
And you all are invested, first of all, globally, second of all, across asset classes. Could you talk about kind of different sectors that maybe you are particularly optimistic about given the current landscape, and also those that you might be particularly worried about?
Yeah, and the one thing that I will say that I think, and this is, I'm trying to stay relatively nonpartisan, or at least apolitical. But the one thing that I do think this administration has done in a really short time from a regulation perspective, they deregulated some things, but in some things they've re-regulated. And what I mean by that is the FCC is actually making decisions again. So the FCC, which regulates, telecommunications, it was very difficult to invest in telecom in the previous administration because the FCC didn't make very many decisions, right? They would identify, and you think about, and I think even Jon Stewart was, flabbergasted at what they did around Starlink and how they pulled funding, but there haven't been any homes in rural America connected, and they've just sat on, I think they've spent billions of dollars and no one's actually been connected. And so I think what has been very, investable and still is very investable is this FCC is like making decisions. They're saying, hey, this is a problem. We need proposals. We're not going to say yes to everything. We've got rules. We've got to make decisions, but we're going to identify problems and we're going to take solutions. And so we've invested. We made a big investment in a company that's trying to build an alternative to GPS that the FCC identified as a problem. And I think it's something that's critical infrastructure that. Previously, the previous administration talked about GPS as a problem, but this administration is like making decisions. And I think that's something that's a big positive. I think the opportunity within energy, where you're going to have, we need to figure out how we can maximize our energy independence. I think I think you look at it, a lot of the people that helped get him elected don't love the price of crude right now, but he's doing what he said he was going to do. And I think it's still going to be an opportunity to invest. So from our perspective, we're trying to kind of just watch what the administration is going to do, and where those opportunities arise.
Absolutely. Well, I'd love to hear more about your personal journey, Drew, in the alternative asset management space. What has been your pathway to getting here? And then after that, I have more questions about what's happening specifically in Dallas.
Sure. So Jim and I are the exact same age. I started where I went to University of Virginia. I grew up in Virginia Beach, Virginia. Then worked at Goldman Sachs right out of undergrad in New York. We graduated in 2000, and so I started in leveraged finance. But by the time we were actually working on the desk by the time we went through analyst training in September, the bubble had burst. Leveraged finance, we weren't issuing anything because everything we'd issued over the past couple years was distressed, and I moved from leveraged finance capital markets to distressed because we were analyzing fiber in the ground and wireless spectrum and cell tower businesses that had just spent billions of dollars and didn't have any customers yet, and that was my introduction to not only to Wall Street but really to investing, and I loved it. It was really, really right place, right time, where no one knew how to value these businesses, but you learned, similar to what Jim's talking about, this is an asset that's irreplaceable, and if I can just hold on to this asset, people are going to make a lot of money. For me, I knew I liked the investing side, and I didn't necessarily want to work at a big investment bank, and so I moved relatively 2 years out to a small hedge fund called Fir Tree Partners, where it was a great opportunity because I got to invest across capital structures and in a really flat organization. I did everything from getting the coffee to sorting the mail to making investment recommendations, and we got to do everything in between. And so that was a really flat and steep learning curve, flat opportunity set, but steep learning curve. And then moving on in 2004, Fortress had been founded by Wes Edens and Pete Brigger. Pete was a partner at Goldman when I was there. And I knew of him, and what he was building felt like that was where the world was going in terms of alternative asset managers. And so I made a kind of relatively lateral move, or maybe even a move down, because we were the same. Fortress was the same size as Fir Tree at the time, and I was like the 5th person on the investment team at Fir Tree, and I was like the 100th person at Fortress. But I was really betting on what they were building at Fortress being different, and so I've been at Fortress since 2005.
Okay, so tell us about, I think everyone here is familiar with the rise of Y'all Street here in Dallas. How are you viewing the opportunity for just generally the investment space here in Dallas. What does it mean for the city? And also, what does it mean generally for the public markets with the whole Texas Stock Exchange, things like that?
Sure. I'll take the first part. When we moved here from San Francisco, again, I had a lot of family reasons to do it, and so I actually didn't want to make anyone move, and so we were doing it for family reasons. I didn't want to make people that were in their routines pick up and leave, and so after telling my partners or talking about it with my partners and deciding it, the second person I called was my assistant, a woman named Io, who was from the Bay Area. She is single, but she was a lifelong Oakland resident, and I told her, Io, you're going to hear about this. Everyone loves you. If you want to manage the office, like your job is safe. You don't have to move. She called me like 4 days later and said, I've never been to Texas, but I'd love to come check it out. And she came here, and her commute in the Bay Area, we were in the city. Our office was in the city. She was living in Oakland, renting an apartment, taking the BART, which is the Bay Area Rapid Transit, and it's third world and not safe. And she was like, our office is now in Knox Henderson. She looked at a townhome within 1.5 miles from the office and was like, is this how a mortgage works? If I put, I've saved up money, and if I put this money down and I make this this is my mortgage, my mortgage payment's going to be less than what I pay in rent in Oakland. And I'm going to own a 3-bedroom townhome. And so she was actually the first person that signed up.
Oh, wow.
And then,
how could you say no to that townhouse?
That's right. Yeah, and she bought that house 4.5 years ago, or 4 years ago. So
That's
she's
great.
done well. But then Josh Pack, who's my co-CEO, he decided to move here. And I think when he moved here, he decided to move here, it became a little bit more of, okay, this is going to be a real center of gravity for our business. And so we started to have more folks come down to look. And so that part's been amazing. And again, I think it's, a good place to raise a family. I think you can have a lot of different things depending on what is important to you from a work life or from a family perspective. And it's been great. We're at 150, 170 now, and we've got building out a third floor, and we'll have 200 plus, I think, within a couple of years. To go back to the Texas Stock Exchange. In all honesty, we were not at all. I think we've actually probably gotten more press than we deserve around this. Jim Lee, who's the CEO and is the co-founder, he deserves a lot of the credit, and Governor Abbott deserves a whole lot of the credit, because I think he really does believe in what they're doing. And I think the biggest thing is, if you talk to people about taking a company public, there's a tremendous amount of barriers to getting a company public, and then even once it's public, it's incredibly expensive. And I think really at the heart of what Texas Stock Exchange is trying to do is try to make it easier to go public and easier to stay public. And I think just like you think about why are businesses moving to Texas, they're trying to make it easy to do business in Texas. And I think there was a question, we had an event in Austin at the governor's mansion, and someone tried to paint this as like a political idea, and he said, no, this is the most apolitical thing in the world. We're actually depoliticizing being public, and this is about doing business, and where do what is a concern for a public company, and when hopefully when we get through the regulators sometime next year, it's not going to be a political pitch. It's going to be, here's why it's easier to go public on the Texas Stock Exchange. And you look at what's passed this legislative session, both with transaction fees, being in the Constitution, as being against the Texas Constitution, and then on top of that, with some of the board stuff that I think is making it much easier and better to domicile your corporate boards here. I think it's, again, back to like very deliberate policy. So I think New York Stock Exchange coming here, that's great. NASDAQ coming here, that's great. As far as I can tell, those are like sales offices. And I think ultimately they're not going to be headquartered here, and maybe they will change here, and then that will be competition as well. So I think this is really about free markets. And
Absolutely.
And I'll just chime in.
Please,
it really
please.
is great what they're doing, because if any of you have seen the data, and maybe there's some people in the audience who have a public company, but over the last 20 years, the number of public companies in our country has essentially been cut in half. And now running one for 5 years, I can see why, because the amount of time and pain you have just dealing with litigation and all of these things that are just so outside the purview of, managing your business and doing what's thoughtful for shareholders. There's just a lot of nonsense that you have to deal with as a public company. And so to get competition is a really good thing. We need, obviously public companies are a very efficient, liquid way of getting capital, badly needed capital to companies. And so to the extent that we can get that to be competitive, Texas is doing an amazing thing for the country. So.
Well, and if you think about what is an exchange now that most trading is done, in dark pools and all sorts of different liquidity. At the end of the day, the exchanges right now, if you're listed on the New York Stock Exchange, your first trade is technically on the New York Stock Exchange, and your last trade is on the New York Stock Exchange or the NASDAQ, and everything in between, it doesn't really matter. I mean, like Tesla, for instance, is listed on NASDAQ, and 13% of Tesla's daily volume is actually traded on the NASDAQ. And that's basically the first print and the last print. And so I do think there's a tremendous amount of white space for the Texas Stock Exchange to again, how is Texas Stock Exchange going to compete? They're going to have to compete on price. They're going to have to compete on liquidity. They're going to have to make it, cheaper for companies to go public, all of which just make it, I think, make commerce easier, which to us is what will help, business thrive.
Yeah, and Jim, could you talk more about kind of how this rise of Y'all Street is potentially impacting your business directly? Or maybe it's not.
Well, no, lots of thoughts, I guess. It's interesting you said that about the trade. So I'm sure you've all seen the pictures, when the market opens or closes, you see all the screens in the background and you see people wearing the jackets, trading. And that's all just marketing these days, right? It's really, you go to the New York Stock Exchange and it's, a handful of people and then a bunch of screens, and, it's obviously all, on computers now. And so there's really not a lot to it as a physical place in New York on the exchange, other than it's a TV studio set. And so I think the fact that there was this, traditional base, and we're an NYSE listed company, but there's not a lot there other than that's just where it all happens. So I think that's all a really good thing. Other than that, I'm not much involved in it other than, we're a public company in Texas, and I guess I'll be waiting for Drew to ask us to be moving over.
Elon posted a good a tweet today where he had like an off ramp, and the sign forward was Delaware, and the off ramp was Texas, and it was like a pile up to get off going to Texas. So I think if you think about the cost that Elon's companies have borne to relocate their headquarters here, which is obviously a ton of switching costs, versus the cost to redomicile your corporate board to Texas versus Delaware. I think there's going to be a lot of companies that will do that now that they've passed this, and they passed it as unanimously, or I think maybe there was one dissenting vote. So I think it really will. You will see a lot of businesses move their corporate boards here, which again I think is great for Texas.
Okay, so this room is full of various leaders of Dallas across industries. The Cary Council is really focused on developing the next generation of leadership, and we are lucky to be sitting here with two incredible leaders. Could you all talk about kind of how you think about what this moment, whether it's in your companies or in the broader business landscape, what this moment is calling for in a great leader?
It's a tough one. I think it's pretty clear from the headlines, some of what we touched on earlier, of how much the world is really changing from a economic framework standpoint. I do think whether we get sort of a quick deal as a signal, we've set off on a new course here where we are going to see breakdowns of global trade the way they have worked, the way it has worked for the last 30 years. And that is going to create tremendous opportunity, of course. And so I think a great leader, and there are lots of ways, I don't have a lot of hard and fast rules because I've found from studying great leaders over the years, there are lots of ways. There are, some leaders that are huge personalities, and there's some that are introverts, and they're sort of, the old expression is there are lots of ways to get to the bank, I guess. But I do think that it's really important in this environment, particularly for younger people, coming out, as you think about your path, think about the direction that the world is headed, and that some of the, I think, some of the traditional paths, the world will look very different in the next 10 or 20 years, obviously with the themes of AI, but also just with how the geopolitical structure is going to change. And so I do think there'll be some great business opportunities around that, and I think it's good for the country. So, hopefully there'll be some people who want to take a little bit more risk on that front. And that obviously, someone who can take some risk and figure out how to make it work and have resilience around that, usually in 10 or 20 years, they're considered a great leader.
How about you, Drew?
Yeah, it's a good question. Look, I think the great leaders that I know, they need to have a vision and they need to be focused, but they also need to be flexible and identify when the world is changing. And I think, at least our own view that I share with Jim is that I do think there's some things that are changing that we're not rushing to make decisions. We're trying to kind of take a step back and just think and read a lot and try to understand, what is changing, and think about not rush to make decisions. Because I think particularly under this administration, it's like things do happen really fast, and sometimes they get reversed really fast. So we're really kind of taking a step back, and literally the past week, we've talked about like investor calls and this and that. It's like, let's get investors as much information as we can on our portfolio, and hey, here's what's affected. Here's what we think is affected by Doge. Here's what's affected by tariffs and everything in between. But the reality is, we don't know. Like, it's too early to tell. And so let's start to think about how are we positioning for where the puck's going. And I am reminded, the quote, "Not all readers are leaders, but all leaders are readers." And I do think we try to read a lot these days, and at times like this is kind of where we do the most.
Absolutely. Do you all have any advice for this audience around, I think we're all a group that is really, really driven in our community and in our businesses to really have a big impact, whether it's on the balance sheet or beyond the balance sheet. Do you all have any advice for this group?
Want to go first on that?
Well, it's a pretty accomplished group. Look, maybe because we're relatively newer to Dallas, I am very bullish on what is happening here, because I do think, I've lived in New York, I lived in San Francisco. I do think that this has a sustainability to it. And while if you've lived here for a long time, people think, oh, it goes up and down. And of course, we're going to go through cycles. But I think what's happening here from a business perspective is something that I think is really sustainable and really is, frankly, just getting legs. And so I think we are very bullish on what's happening here. I think we haven't talked about data centers, but you look at what's happening in Texas and the access to power and energy, and the fact that Texas is trying to lean in on that and take advantage of the fact that, okay, we have power sources, but we also have a lot of land, and so there's a lot of areas here that can really be leaders in that respect, and just continuing to kind of think about where the world's going.
And I'll just continue on that, and which is, when you think about your career, I guess as time goes on, I think ultimately when you look back, you remember how important your family is, and that's obviously the most important thing, and the time that you get with them. And I think actually one of the really great things about Dallas is that this is a great place to have for families, right? It's a great place to raise a family. It's a very warm, welcoming, friendly, positive community, all the right attributes. But it's also a big city where there's opportunity and a lot of stuff happening. So it's a good place to be. So if you're here, you've selected a great place. And then again, I think this is obvious, but I think it's good to hear, because over the years I've come to these things, and I've always tried to do pattern recognition, and I've read all the books about every great leader and all of these things. And then I think resilience is so important, and it just, a lot of people say, like, do what you love, or they say all of these things, and the only thing that I've found that sort of is a real pattern of truth across everything is that in hindsight, it always looks easier than it was, or it looks much cleaner than it was, as far as, the 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Having now running a business where for the first 4 years, it was on the forefront of a chapter 22, which is, a second chapter 11. Just that experience of keep moving forward, and then you wake up and wow, that really is, you can give up at any point, and then you don't get to that moment. So I would just say, remind yourself to just accept the 1 step backward with the 2 steps forward, and keep being resilient, and then spend as much time with your family as you can.
That's great advice. Thank you. And before we get to some quick rapid fire, I wanted to ask you all one final question that we like to ask all of our guests here on Learning from Leaders, which is, who are some of the mentors that have been most influential in you all's professional lives?
It's an interesting one for me, because I, sort of had the youth and inexperience to go out on my own at a young age. So I didn't necessarily get trained under anyone. But there were definitely people over the years who were helpful and thoughtful. I had some early investors who were, famous value investors or hedge fund managers who were really generous and spent a lot of time with me. I think my mentors probably over the years, were a little bit more, because I sort of had gone off on my own early in starting a business, were more peers. I would say Drew is, would certainly be at the top of that list, because, obviously we were in parallel paths doing different things, but having someone who was, in my opinion, at the center of the world in finance, just sort of at one of the big alternative asset managers, really making things happen, being able to share ideas with. So I consider you one. Having a lot of peers in different areas was sort of my experience, I would say.
Look, Pete Brigger, who's the founder of Fortress and is the chairman. I think, one of the things in alternative asset management that I think there's been great parts about the industry, but there's been a lot of founders and next generation folks that have been disasters. And usually that's because it's either like the rising, the next generation stabbing them in the back and pushing them off the side, or the founder, having a midlife crisis and running off with someone in his firm. It's something where it's usually a crisis, and Pete has been very, very, very deliberate. I mean, I've worked with him for 20 plus years. Josh has worked with him for 23 years. And we've been very deliberate about talking about this with our investors. And I think Josh and I are very fortunate that Pete really actually wants us to be successful, because there's some founders who I would leave out that they might allow it to happen, but part of them is sort of rooting for their next generation to fail, because they want to be able to say they can never do it like I could do it. They need me, and they want to be needed. And Pete, Josh and I are very fortunate that Pete literally is like, he views our success as a direct reflection of him. And so he's really one of those parents. It's like a parent where he wants you to be successful and wants us to be independent and wants us to be successful. So that's number one. And then number two, and I'm not just saying this to Jim, but I think one of the things that one of the reasons why I think Jim and I have a relationship that we do is we will freaking disagree about stuff. And he'll be like, you're totally wrong. And part of why I think I call him is because I know he will tell me no, you're totally wrong. And I'll push back on him, when I think he's wrong. And so I do think finding, either it's mentors or someone else who actually will also not just tell you what you want to hear. I think boards are very important, and good boards are boards that really, have a real discussion, and cultivate a culture of really actually pushing back on each other to
So I have
evolve.
two good stories on that, just to reiterate that. I think I've told you this a bunch before. You may have heard me say it, but so, I worked briefly, I sat next to Drew at Fortress for a brief period of time, but I remember when I got hired there, actually, I interviewed with Pete, Drew's mentor, Pete Brigger, the founder, and I remember when he, I met with him, he said, you can work here if you want, but you're useless to me. And I said, excuse me? So what? And he said, I'll hire you, but you'll learn a bunch, and then you'll leave quickly and go do your own thing. And so by the time you get of value to me, you'll be gone. But he's like, if you really want to work here, fine, you can come work here. And so I ended up taking the job, but he was right. I left, after about a year, and I was useless to him. But that brutal honesty, I think that culture of just sort of brutal honesty really obviously was, very effective. And I've tried to carry that. Actually, my brother's in the audience. He's worked with me for a decade. I've tried to surround myself with people who can really go out and and we have a culture like that at MP, and my relationship certainly with Drew is like that, is like, we will tell it like it is and we will fight it out. And by the way, there's been times, and hopefully Ty, you can attest to this, that, I will disagree with my team and I'm the boss. And then at the end of, I'll totally disagree with them. And at the end of the conversation, I'll be like, you guys are right. Okay. And there's just no pride about it. And hopefully my team feels that way. And so even though I'm really tough and I'm like, I'll disagree with them hard, and it's hard to go up against your boss like that. But there'll be times where the entire conversation, I'm just like, you're a complete idiot, you're wrong, blah, blah, blah. I don't care and I want to hear it. And then I'll just be like, okay, you're right, fine. And that's, and I think that we've definitely avoided a lot of mistakes and have made a lot of great decisions, from that kind of mindset.
Absolutely. Well, before we open it up for Q&A, I have a couple of rapid fire questions for you all. So just the first thing that comes to mind. Okay, Tex-Mex or barbecue? Jim?
Tex-Mex.
Tex-Mex.
Okay. If you could have dinner with any historical figure, who would it be?
Oh, that's so tough. Do you have one first?
Probably Thomas Jefferson, but
yeah, that's a good one. I'll go George Washington. Okay. Yeah, founding fathers.
Okay, favorite sports team?
I grew up in Florida, so Miami Dolphins.
Okay.
Long story, my next door neighbor's from Tyler, Texas, Cowboys.
Nice.
Danny White jersey was my first jersey, and I had, in Virginia Beach, Virginia, I had Cowboy wallpaper, which was like the heart of Redskins country.
But I will say, if I'm a couple more years in Texas, I'll officially be a Cowboys fan.
Okay, good. Yeah, then you'll be official at that point. Okay, what's your favorite book?
That's a really tough one. I don't read, pretty much, I never read fiction anymore. I read just business and business history books. So I don't think I have a favorite. Sorry to fail you on the spot here, but I can't think of a favorite. There's just been so many. I don't know if you have one, maybe one I'll pop in my head.
I'm similar, and we trade a lot of books. The book I read that I just recommended to Jim is Technological Republic. That's by Alex Karp, who's the founder of Palantir. And I actually think there's a lot of parallels to what Palantir's done and what Jim's doing at MP, but that just came out and it's fantastic.
I do actually recommend reading Lighthizer book, because I do think he is, if you want to kind of really understand the environment, I think he is sort of, I actually didn't have high expectations, but I thought it was sort of very eye-opening to understand this environment. And I've got a couple, I don't have a good recommendation on it because I've got a few that I'm going back and forth, but I'm trying to read about how business worked with government in the World War II and post-World War II era to understand the art of the possible. And there's a few books on this topic, like Freedom's Forge and some others. I don't have a recommendation yet, but just to really understand how that worked well together and what are some of the pitfalls, because I do think we're headed into this era, particularly for me, just given my company. And so I don't know where your focus is, but I do think one of the big secular themes will be restoring national security industries. And there'll be a lot of non-traditional, or at least what we think of as historical traditional structures. There'll be a lot of interesting ways that business and government work together over the next decade if we sort of continue on this trajectory that sort of seems like we're on.
Well, and one of the things that this book that Technological Republic talks about is he identifies like Microsoft, and you had, this is I guess probably 5 or 7 years ago, I remember the headline where Microsoft had employees talking about leaving the firm or going on strike because Microsoft was hired by the Department of Defense to work on night vision goggles. And they felt like they weren't signing up to do that. And you think about Microsoft as this company that's, it's a global company, but it's an American company that has benefited from being in America and our soldiers across the globe defending, the American way of life. And he talks about this sort of the pendulum had swung so far where, think about DARPA and you think about even the semiconductor companies in the 1950s and 60s coming out of it. They're really like partnerships with the Defense Department. And that was where Silicon Valley and innovation was. And that pendulum swung to where they would not even think about working on night vision goggles. And now that pendulum is swinging back, and you've got, companies like Palantir and, companies like Anduril and, all the Palmer Luckey and Joe Lonsdale, and, really this sort of reindustrialization of America. And I do think it's incredibly hopeful. And I think part of what the Defense Department's talking about doing, and you think about, just sort of rethinking how we do things, and you think about the primes and how, they cost plus in all these contracts versus what Anduril's done in a really, really, really short period of time, or what Palantir's done in maybe a longer period of time, but with much less, a much smaller budget. So it's trying to read all those things and listen to tons of podcasts.
And since we're on this theme now that we're going down this rabbit hole, and I can get really wonky about it, the book I'm reading right now, I'm only 20 pages in, so I don't have it, is called The Corporation That Changed the World, and it's about the East India Company. And the reason I think that connects with right now is what Drew was talking about with all these cutting edge tech companies that now need to be being more closely aligned with government. But it's just this concept of, one of the things that's very unique about this time is, if you think of the Cold War, we faced communism. That was our big adversary. Now we're in sort of, some Cold War 2.0 or whatever it is, but our geopolitical adversary is really a mercantilist power, right? And one of the things, and you have to credit the Chinese for this, what they've done really effectively is they're very smart about creating national champions, state-backed entities that can use really the weapon of the free market against itself. And so I do think that understanding, so that the East India Company was like the birth of the corporation, and how this, sort of the state originally sort of went into that process. So I'm actually going way back to think about that, and I think that that whole menu of sort of the very beginning through to how it works now could be valuable to understand sort of some of the opportunity set now, because we really need to figure out how does, and I don't have an answer to this question. If I did, I'd be doing it, or I'd tell you, but is how do we in a free market in national security industries counteract mercantilism?
When you think about when I talked about the FCC, right? I mean, China is not where, if they want to evolve from 5G to 6G or satellite technology, they're making decisions. And we've got, I don't think we're supposed to make decisions like China does, but like that company I was talking about on augmenting GPS, right? The only opposition we have right now, or that company has right now, is from ham radio operators that are like, well, we're going to have interference and we're ham radio operators. And you think about that from like a national security perspective. And we, of course, we want to protect property rights, and we want to protect all the things that I do think are part of the American way of life. But we also have to think about how do we make decisions, and how can we relocate the ham radio operators somewhere else on the dial, and we'll buy every ham radio operator a new ham radio. Ways to protect them so the ham radio operators can keep talking to each other, even though the internet has been invented since ham radio. But it's things like that I do feel like we have to be able to compete with China, because they are definitely competing with us.
What is y'all's favorite hobby outside of work?
Well, I'm pretty simple that way. I try to stay in good shape, and I love watching movies or TV, and other than that, I spend time with my family. I don't have any other major hobbies.
Yeah, I'm kind of the same. I've got two teenagers, so I'm now, my daughter's a junior.
Staying busy with them?
My daughter's a junior, so we're savoring every moment.
And I've got an 18-month-old daughter, so.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you. Yes. I try not to miss the wake up and bedtimes.
Okay, I have one more question for you both. Finish this sentence. Texas is, fill in the blank.
Growing.
Okay.
Texas is welcoming and a land of opportunity.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you both so much for being here, Jim and Drew, and thank you so much to the Cary Council for being here. What an interesting and lively conversation. We so appreciate you all's time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Learning from Leaders. If you enjoyed this episode, we invite you to subscribe now for monthly episode drops so that you can continue to learn from experienced business and community leaders to help you drive meaningful change in your community.